Ranking Member Senator Wyden for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to you, Mr. Mnuchin. This is our first hearing of the 115th Congress, so there's a bit of housekeeping. First, congratulations to my friend Senator Hatch on his selection to continue leading the committee on behalf of the majority. I also want to welcome our two new members, Senator McCaskill and Senator Cassidy. We are lucky to have you both. Now to the business at hand. Aside from the President, there may be no individual with a tighter grasp on the levers of our economy than the Secretary of Treasury. That has been true since the days of Alexander Hamilton. When you read about the nominee for Treasury Secretary, given all the power that this position holds, you hope not to see phrases like foreclosure machine, redlining, offshore funds, and predatory lending. I'm sure today's hearing is going to cover a wide range of matters, whether it's Mr. Mnuchin's background and qualifications or the incoming administration's policy agenda. I'm going to begin with a topic that cuts across all of these matters: the truly disgusting inequity and abuse of America's tax laws. The tax code today is a tale of two systems. For wage earners, like cops and nurses, there aren't any special tax dodges. The rules that apply to them are firm and involuntary. Once or twice a month, their taxes come right out of their paychecks. No cutting corners. The rules are different for the powerful and the well-connected. They have armies of lawyers and accountants at their disposal. With the right advice, the most fortunate individuals in our country can decide for themselves how much tax to pay and when to pay it. So let's look at Mr. Mnuchin's history. There is no clearer example than Mr. Mnuchin's hedge fund setting up outposts in Anguilla and the Cayman Islands, an action that can be explained only by the island's 0% tax rate. It certainly wasn't for ease of commute or the infrastructure. In Mr. Mnuchin's case, millions of dollars in profits from Hollywood exports like the movie Avatar were funneled to an offshore web of entities and investors. When Mr. Mnuchin's bank was up for a merger that had the potential to deliver a huge financial gain, a foundation he chaired reportedly used tax-exempt dollars to fund an AstroTurf campaign pushing for the deal's approval. In the public comment period of a potential merger, that is the equivalent of stuffing the ballot box. Mr. Mnuchin operates 7 personal trusts, including one known as a dynasty trust that will shield tens of millions of dollars from taxes. In my view, if you look at our history, our nation wanted to reward merit, not to perpetuate dynasties. Now, as a nominee for a cabinet position, Mr. Mnuchin could be in line for a special elective federal tax deferral on money made by selling stocks and bonds. This is the very definition of getting to pay what you want when you want. Now, there is a common answer when these kind of tax tricks come under a spotlight. It's said that people who use them are just following the laws on the books, and that might be true. The outrage in tax law is what is legal, and that every member of the Senate has allowed it to stay legal. In my view, this outrage is going to change only when taxpayers are no longer divided into 2 very different sets of tax rules. Now, this provides a segue into important policy questions. Setting aside Mr. Mnuchin's finances and background, the tax reform agenda already being advanced by the president-elect would perpetuate and, in fact, worsen the unfairness in the tax code. On the campaign trail, the president-elect delivered lots of tough talk about fixing the tax system. He said he alone could fix it because he had spent a career using the system to his advantage. As for the details, the few position papers that were put forward didn't get a whole lot of attention outside the business pages. But after Mr. Mnuchin's nomination was announced, he laid down a clear and specific marker. So I'll quote Mr. Mnuchin directly. Any reductions we have in upper income taxes would be offset by less deductions, so there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. Let me repeat that, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to start calling it the Minuchin Rule. No absolute tax cut for the upper class. So let's take stock of what's already happening on Capitol Hill. The first major act of the unified Republican government, repealing the Affordable Care Act, would immediately violate the pledge of no tax cuts for the wealthy. Bottom line, the ACA repeal scheme that was kicked off last week is a Trojan horse of tax breaks for the most fortunate. It's paid for by taking tax benefits for health insurance away from millions of working people. Then it's back for round two under an emerging Republican plan to fast-track an even bigger tax break for the wealthy. In my view, this is proof that the campaign promises about fixing the tax system were pretty much a head fake. For example, the president-elect said he'd close the carried interest loophole. It's a favorite of investment fund managers, but his plan actually gives them a 25% tax cut. In fact, it slashes tax rates for corporations and the wealthy across the board at a cost of trillions of dollars. So it sounds to me like the Minuchin Rule is already on the ropes. Now, what would the new administration's tax plan do for people of more modest incomes? Millions of working parents, mostly single, would get hit with tax increases because they'd lose head of household status when they file. If you wanted to write a tax plan that would push even more working class folks out of the economic winner's circle, that's how you do it. Now, given how central tax policy is to our jurisdiction, I hope the committee is able to discuss those issues today. But of course, the Treasury Secretary and this committee handle a lot more than taxes. So there are other issues to raise. On a broad level, it's my view that senators need to make a judgment call about what sort of person they want to head the Treasury Department. Mr. Mnuchin's career began in trading financial products that helped to bring on the housing crash and the Great Recession. After nearly 2 decades at Goldman Sachs, he left in 2002 and joined a hedge fund. In 2004, he spun off a hedge fund of his own, Dune Capital. It was only a few lackluster years before Dune began to wind down its investments in 2008. In early 2009, Mr. Mnuchin led a group of investors that purchased a bank called IndyMac, and they renamed it One West. Colleagues, One West was truly unique. While Mr. Mnuchin was CEO, the bank proved it could put more vulnerable people on the street faster than just about anybody else around. While Mr. Mnuchin was CEO, a One West vice president admitted in a court proceeding to robo-signing upwards of 750 disclosure documents a week. She spent less than 30 seconds on each. And in fact, she shortened her signature to speed the process along. Investigations found that the bank frequently mishandled documents and skipped over reviewing them. All it took to plunge families into the nightmare of potentially losing their home was 30 seconds of sloppy paperwork and a few haphazard signatures. These tactics were in use between 2009 and 2014, a period during which the bank foreclosed on more than 35,000 homes. Widow foreclosures on reverse mortgages. One West did more of those than anybody else. Now, the bank defends its record on loan modifications, but it was found guilty of an illegal practice known as dual tracking. One bank department tells homeowners to stop making payments so they can pursue modification, while another department presses on and hurdles those folks into foreclosure. One West made only 2 loans to African-American borrowers in 2014 and 2015, according to an analysis by the California Reinvestment Coalition. Just a fraction of its branches occupied storefronts in minority communities. None were in predominantly African-American communities. But minorities still represented a disproportionately large share of the people that got booted out of their homes. Under Mr. Mnuchin, One West churned out foreclosures like Chinese factories churned out Trump suits and ties. And with the combination of extreme foreclosure tactics and a bailout from the FDIC, One West became a rainmaker for Mr. Mnuchin and his fellow investors. At precisely the same time the foreclosure machine was running, One West funds were poured into glamorous investments in Hollywood. In 2012, One West struck an agreement to loan hundreds of millions of dollars to a movie studio called Relativity Media. In 2014, while he was CEO of One West's holding company, Mr. Mnuchin bought his own stake in Relativity. He took a seat in the boardroom, was appointed co-chairman. He even bought a private jet with Relativity's co-founder. But the company quickly tanked. One West pulled out $50 million, emptying several Relativity accounts, including one earmarked for guild expenses that expanded wages for contractors and tradesmen. Mr. Mnuchin bailed out just before the studio declared bankruptcy. There have been press reports that the FBI has denied a Freedom of Information Act request concerning Relativity Media on the ground that disclosure is likely to interfere with a pending law enforcement proceeding. I have read the FBI background report on Mr. Mnuchin, and I saw no discussion of any such enforcement action in the report. That may be entirely appropriate. But Mr. Chairman, I want to continue to work with you to find out what the enforcement proceeding cited in the Freedom of Information Act denial is and how it relates to the nominee, if it does at all. For Mr. Mnuchin, Relativity Media's failure wasn't a lot of a setback, considering the profits that One West's foreclosure machine was still pulling in. The purchase price of the bank was less than $1.6 billion. After 5 years of foreclosures and profits, it sold for $3.4 billion to CIT Group. Now, outside One West and Relativity, Mr. Mnuchin spent years as a director of the holding company for Sears, obviously an iconic American brand. He served on the committee that watchdogged the Employee Pension Fund. The record shows that that plan was routinely mismanaged and underfunded. Retirees saw their pensions cut, losing a monthly health care stipend that was enough to offset roughly a third of the premiums the seniors pay for Medicare Part B. Sears also shuttered hundreds of stores nationwide over the last few years and recently announced another round of closures. Once again, showing a truly impressive capacity to advantage himself while others fell behind, Mr. Mnuchin joined a small group of investors that spun off the company's real estate into a separate trust. It was arguably the most valuable asset Sears had left. So as retirees watched their pensions shrink and Sears' remaining workers worry about an uncertain future, this small number of powerful individuals made out just fine. Now I'm going to wrap up, and I just want to step back for a moment to talk about the role of the Secretary of Treasury. This is the person who's going to have enormous influence over Americans' paychecks and mortgages, the caliber of job opportunities they face, the safety and stability of the financial system that holds and invests their hard-earned money, and much more. This is a position that has the power to help reverse decades of yawning inequality that has hollowed out the middle class, dimmed the hopes of so many young people, and left millions buried in debt. The Treasury Secretary ought to be somebody who works on behalf of all Americans, including those who still wait for the economic recovery to show up in their communities. When I look at Mr. Mnuchin's background, it is a real stretch to find hard evidence that he would be that kind of Treasury Secretary. Now, just finally, Mr. Chairman, one other bit of housekeeping. I want to make it very clear that Democrats have in no way been obstructing Mr. Mnuchin's confirmation. We are doing our jobs to truly vet this nominee. We are, in fact, colleagues, doing it as we've been doing it for almost 20 years on a bipartisan basis. And if you have any questions about the fairness of it, ask Tim Geithner about what it was like in 2009. And I want to point out that at your request, Mr. Chairman, I agreed to shorten the normal one-week notice period to all so that Mr. Mnuchin's hearing could be held today. Ultimately, nominations hearings are about hearing what the nominee is for. So, Mr. Minuchin, that is what today is all about. We look forward to your testimony. I note also we have a couple members of the House, and we want to welcome them as well.
Well, thank you, Senator. We're pleased to welcome